Welcome to Hard Talk. I'm Stephen Sacker. After months of posturing and prevaricating, the Brexit endgame is underway. This is the week the UK government and the EU 27 earmarked for agreeing a deal on the divorce and outlining a future close relationship. But on the eve of another EU summit, there's still talk of an impasse. It focuses on the Irish border with Northern Ireland and Northern Ireland's status post-Brexit. Well, my guest today is Mairead McGuinness, Irish MEP and Vice President of the European Parliament. Is Brexit about to get very messy and very costly? Mairead McGuinness, welcome to Hard Talk.
Glad to be here.
Are you surprised that after a year and a half of intense negotiation between UK and EU officials, here we are with this endgame that I just described underway, and it seems the issue of the Irish border and the post-Brexit status of Northern Ireland are obstacles that cannot be overcome?
I'm disappointed. Maybe I'm not surprised, but I'm not without hope. So just let me take this week, because everyone's quite anxious about what didn't happen at the weekend. But what is happening is the talks are continuing. So there's no sense that there's a breakdown, but there's an impasse. And it's not surprising that the issue of Northern Ireland and the island of Ireland is the issue that the withdrawal agreement, if you like, still has to be completed on. Because remember, it isn't just the EU or me as an Irish MEP or the Irish government insisting on this. The United Kingdom, the British Prime Minister, last December signed up to an absolute commitment that there would be no hard borders, no return to the past on the island of Ireland, repeated that in March. In fact, there's a text on the table, a draft withdrawal, divorce, if you like, agreement, and the incomplete parts are around Northern Ireland. What has troubled me, I have to say, is that normally when we negotiate, certainly at EU level, a paper's produced. I don't like what's on your paper, for example, but I'm going to propose changes. And guess what? You won't agree with all of them, but you'll take some on board. That has not happened in these negotiations. What is happening, and this is the troubling part that I hope we can get over, is that the UK side, and that is their right to do this, have said, well, we don't like the withdrawal agreement on Northern Ireland. We're proposing that in the future relationship we'll agree to this, if you like, time-limited customs arrangement, temporary customs arrangement, and in a way trying to, if you like, reverse the future into the present.
Right.
If I'm making sense, it is complicated.
Well, you're making sense, but I am very aware that for people in Britain and around the world, there is a great deal of complication here. Okay. But if I unpick it, what you seem to be saying is that the British government, led by Theresa May, is reneging on promises made when it comes to this so-called Irish backstop.
If I wanted to use that word, I would, but I'm not using it. I think she hasn't delivered yet on promises made. That is a big step from saying she's reneging on. I understand the pressure that she's under. We're not blind to the politics of the Conservative Party. I'm not blind to the fact that the DUP is propping up the Conservative government. There's a budget vote on the 29th of October. But I'll tell you what I'm not blind to as well. I come from a county, Louth, which is a border county with the north of Ireland. In my constituency now, all of the counties along the border with Northern Ireland, they're the people I represent. I drive to Donegal through the north of Ireland, so it's my territory, if you like. And I remember my teenage years and younger when it was not a nice place to be. And therefore, I think those of us who know the value of 20 years of peace and togetherness that isn't complete, but we get on, there's a great community spirit, don't want it impacted negatively by Brexit.
Right, but on the other side of that Northern Irish conflict that you allude to, the unionist side, there is an absolutely implacable opposition to the notion that Northern Ireland could ever be regulated in a different way, have completely different economic rules and a different jurisdiction from the rest of the United Kingdom. They say that's driving a wedge, an unacceptable wedge between their province and the rest of the UK. It cannot happen. And as a result of the position that your government and others are taking in these Brexit negotiations. Sammy Wilson of the DUP has just said that, in his view, a no-deal Brexit is now probably inevitable.
Yeah, well, you see, if I wanted to rise to some of the rhetoric of the DUP and indeed the gentleman Sammy Wilson and others with blood red lines and things like that, I could do it, but it's not going to make progress. So let me pull this back much further. The people of Northern Ireland did not vote to leave the European Union. The United Kingdom collectively did.
But with respect, that is a red herring.
I've said,
I mean, it's a sovereign, Northern Ireland is a sovereign territory of the United Kingdom.
It may be a red herring to you, to the people in the north of Ireland, the majority there. It's not a red herring, it's a fact. However, we have to respect the collective UK vote. Some of the farmers, for example, and I know this industry really well, who voted to leave are now coming to me saying, make sure that my lambs can still be sold into France, make sure that the milk I produce is still European Union milk. So there is an element here of people not understanding what their vote did to their relationship with the European Union. I also would say that within unionism, there's also a desire not to have a hard border. What's lacking is an understanding of where there's no deal or where there's a bad deal, if we don't respect what's in the withdrawal agreement, which frankly, and this is I think what's missing in the understanding, no one wants to use the backstop, but we need it as that insurance policy. We hope that if the backstop is agreed, the withdrawal agreement in its entirety, March comes, the UK leaves, and I regret that, but the UK leaves, and then we have a transition where we come to this future relationship on trade, on standards, which is so, if you like, close and effective. The backstop is not needed.
Those are very emollient words, but here are some somewhat less emollient words from Boris Johnson till recently.
Sorry, he's not in cabinet anymore.
No, he's not. Until recently, let me finish.
I mean, he's
till
a journalist.
Recently,
I mean, I can say this and then I'll let you go on. I mean, I have to say of Mr. Johnson, he was a journalist and I was one as well. But when I became a politician, I left my journalism behind. I'm afraid he's still acting as a journalist, not as a responsible politician. He has been very, very emotive in some of the language he's used around Ireland, and indeed very unhelpful in getting a solution.
If you say, as you did earlier in this interview, you'd like to take some of the heat out of the conversation and just focus on what's achievable, then perhaps what you've just said isn't truly helpful.
Yes, but he's not one of the negotiators. He's not in the British government.
No, he's not. But he's still clearly got an important role to play in the ruling Conservative Party.
Yeah, well, the UK,
let's
Prime
get to the point of what he said, if I may, because what he said is important and you need to respond to it. He says the EU has pushed us around for too long, treating us with naked contempt. They present us with a choice between the breakup of this country or the subjugation of this country. It is a choice between two exquisitely embarrassing humiliations. Now, that's Boris Johnson's position. It's the position of very many influential voices inside the Conservative Party, possibly voices that are sufficient in number to dictate what Theresa May has to do in the future. Don't you need to show some empathy for the feelings they have, particularly on this issue of Northern Ireland?
I mean, in terms of empathy, I get empathy a great deal. But when you say to me that Boris Johnson, who's from a very large member state, and this is what's troubled me about Brexit from the get-go. I'm from a small country. We know our size and we also know our influence. I've been very surprised that the United Kingdom, for all its size and greatness, is so, if you like, under threat that it feels Europe is pushing it about. I mean, that is an extraordinary statement for Boris Johnson to make. The European Union, for all its flaws, works on the basis that around the table, and remember, I come from a small member state, we do have argy-bargies, but we respect each other's positions. We know we need to compromise and we have to move forward. What I would like to see from those who, of the Boris Johnson team, and I'm not so sure the full numbers, but you'd have the facts on that, is what do they propose other than a walk away? And when you walk away, nothing is achieved. It might satisfy that innate, give somebody a kick, but it doesn't actually solve the problems for British business, for supply chains, for the food industry.
We'll get to that.
So
what is actually going to happen in a moment. But if I may, just to continue the thought about Boris Johnson's passion, as it was expressed in that very recent newspaper column, what he is getting at is that for his party, which after all is called the Conservative and Unionist Party, there is something fundamental at stake, which is ensuring the continued unity of the United Kingdom. And they look at what comes out of your own country, Ireland, when it comes to an analysis of where Brexit is. And they listen to statements like the one from your Prime Minister, the leader of your party, Leo Varadkar, the other day, where he said, our job as an Irish government is to look out for the interests of the entire island of Ireland in these Brexit negotiations. He said, we are the party of Europe and we are the United Ireland Party. And it sounds to some Conservative and Unionist politicians as though you have an agenda in your party and indeed in your country, which is to see what's happening in Brexit as a prelude to Irish unification.
But Brexit has nothing to do with all of that. The reason why Ireland and my Taoiseach leader has a role to play in relation to the north of Ireland is because of the Good Friday Agreement. I mean, all governments have a role to play in this because Northern Ireland is a unique entity. We've had violence that I mentioned through my own childhood. We have peace for 20 years. We have tried to build bridges between communities that in a way were very divided, and sadly because of Brexit those divisions are beginning again. Be very clear, and just on a united Ireland, that can only happen with the will of the people of Northern Ireland.
That is absolutely right.
And the island of Ireland.
And it is not on
the agenda now whatsoever. And I think to make it, and I've heard
you say it's not on the agenda, but again, the Conservative and Unionist politicians I talk of feel that it is being put on the agenda in Ireland. Let me quote to you Mary Lou MacDonald just today, the leader of Sinn Féin. She said that if there is a no-deal Brexit, as far as she is concerned, the damage will be so severe to all the people of Ireland, we will not stand idly by. There will have to be a cross-border poll on unification.
But it doesn't matter what
it is on her agenda.
It doesn't matter what the leader of Sinn Féin says. The truth and the reality of a border poll, that has to be called by Secretary of State in the north of Ireland. Nobody else can do that. And the sad part about today's politics in the north of Ireland is there's no government. That Sinn Féin and the DUP could not see a way to sit down and have a government that had a voice in the Brexit discussions, and that both, in fact, are using Brexit in a most inappropriate way and not in the best interests of peace and prosperity on our island and ongoing cooperation. On the other hand, I respect where the DUP come from and others in the unionist community. And at the risk of repeating it again, this word annexation of Northern Ireland, this is not what this is about. What we're trying to do is minimise the damage, because Brexit will damage Ireland, the UK, Europe and Northern Ireland. So it's to try and find a mechanism to minimise that damage. And that's my political priority.
I don't want to spend this entire interview just on Brexit, so I'm going to give you some quick fire questions, quick answers, and then we'll move on. If there is no deal, is there bound to be a hard border between your country, the Republic of Ireland, and Northern Ireland? We've
said we won't construct a hard border, and the British have said the same. So that is the position of now.
You see, many others are saying there is bound to be a hard border with no deal, because WTO rules will require it, if nothing else.
Well, I certainly will not vote for anything that would result in a hard border on the island of Ireland, because it would not be just a step backwards, it would be a century, a generation backwards.
But in that case, you're saying the same thing as the Brexiteers in the UK, who are saying, many people who are talking about the necessity of a hard border in the case of a no deal, or indeed just a trade deal, are talking rubbish. There are all sorts of technologies and instruments which make a smooth, frictionless border possible.
Except we don't have it yet. I mean, I've listened to those arguments around technology, and if I may, with respect,
you just said you wouldn't ever support the putting up of customs posts and a hard border.
Because this isn't just about structures and technology. This is about the psychology of that region. Remember that history takes a long time to heal. And indeed, this week in the Parliament, we'll have victims of terrorists coming to talk to us. And the uncertainty that Brexit has caused has hurt a lot of people again. No one believes we're going to go back to those awful days, but we're going backwards in terms of relationships, and none of us want that. So I work very well with my DUP colleagues in the European Parliament.
To paraphrase what you've just said, you're saying there are real present dangers, security risks, if there's a no-deal Brexit and if there has to be some form of restored
No, because
border.
I'm not going to use your words, but what I am saying, it's more, what troubles me more, and I tried to explain this to David Davis at one meeting when he was a part of the Brexit negotiations, that to understand the psychological impact of Brexit, you have to be there, live there, and lived and know what has happened. And I think that's the part of the discussion that people aren't hearing. And you have to obviously respect different views on this, but at some point when language is used like annexation segregation and blood red lines. And some today, for example, I read, and I wouldn't even say it on television, it was quite a vulgar comment about these. I thought, we're going too far here, and that's why calm is required, but also an understanding that the UK is leaving, not the EU breaking up.
It is sucking up so much energy from the European Union.
From me and you, everybody's been
There is an argument to say there are much bigger dangers and challenges facing the EU. And for you, as an official with a sort of overview as Vice President of the European Parliament,
not an official.
Well, fair enough.
There is a difference.
That's fair enough. Your role as Vice President of the European Parliament, how worried are you by the fact that in the midst of all this fuss about Brexit, what we don't seem to be focused on is that certain countries in the EU, like Poland and Hungary, for example, are simply refusing to play by the EU's rules and accept basic EU values when it comes to things like a free media and independence of the judiciary.
Yeah, but I think we all should be worried about that. Of course we're all concerned about it. That's why I voted that there should be an Article 7, a review of what's going on in Hungary.
Article 7 won't work though.
Yeah,
Article 7 doesn't work because not only are Poland and Hungary acting for themselves, but they are acting with the support of a block of countries who will ensure that this so-called Article 7, which would allow them to be disciplined by the EU Commission, the ECJ and others, it won't work.
I know, but I've met Viktor Orban face to face, and I've said to him my concern about what's going on in his country. So be under no illusion that while Brexit is a big issue, we're also dealing with those other fundamentals. And more importantly, at least within the European Union, you have a capacity to influence and to bring Article 7, which you say is not going to work sufficiently.
With respect, you say we are dealing with it under Article 7. Article 7 was triggered last year against Poland. This year, the Poles have pressed on with these judicial changes, which have involved the President basically getting rid of more than 24 senior judges. And the more the EU protests about it, the more the Poles say, we don't care.
Yeah, but you're in a different job than I am. My job is to make sure that the Polish leadership understands that the rule of law has to prevail, even if that takes longer than I would like, that we keep demanding high standards. And the benefit of Europe is that at least these countries are with us around the table, but it doesn't take away from your core point. There are deep divisions around that
but not only are there divisions, it also seems to me that the strain of nativist, nationalist, populist politicians, which would include those in governing in Poland and Hungary, are making the political weather. And parties like yours in the centre-right, that is Fine Gael and the wider bloc in Europe, the European People's Party, they are running scared of these people. Your own bloc refused to expel Viktor Orban's Fidesz, even though you think he is flouting European values.
Well, first of all, I'm not running scared of anyone. I'm from a small country, but I'm pretty brave in my politics. Secondly, the British Conservatives did not vote to sanction Mr. Orban and Hungary, so there's a question for them to answer. And thirdly, the pressure will be relentless. What's happening within the EPP group are deep conversations about what is happening with Viktor Orban. I've eyeballed him and told him what I think about
it. The EPP bottled it. They had an opportunity to say to Fidesz.
We have said very clearly our views of Fidesz, as has Manfred Weber, the leader of our group, who also voted to sanction Hungary. We have not yet got to that point. It may come where we say we cannot be together. But don't conflate no dramatic action with inactivity. There's a huge amount of activity on it.
So you say, but look at the facts.
Not only so I say with respect, so I know because I'm involved in it.
The truth is you have governments across East Europe who refuse to accept the EU notion of burden sharing when it comes to taking quotas of immigrants, on a whole host of other issues, including the creation of a new security force, putting 10,000 guards into Frontex. East Europeans won't buy it. So on all of these issues, when it comes to that hot issue of migration, the notion of collective EU action is just not happening.
Not yet, but the pressure will have to be in that direction. Because for one simple fact, the biggest driver of migratory flows will not be conflict, but it will be climate change, and Europe needs to do more on that. The reason why Italy and those who've been at the forefront of receiving migrants are angry is they feel Europe has abandoned them. The third point is that the numbers of migrants coming to Europe has dramatically decreased, but what's very worrying, if you've any concern about human beings, is that 1 in 18 die. For 18 arrivals, one person dies and has died in the first couple of months of this year. That is a horrific statistic.
But the people
so the
of
bad
Europe
politics,
listen to the arguments about what to do, and they seem increasingly to be buying the arguments of the far right. We're about to go into European
elections. But again, with
elections.
respect, don't mention the peoples of Europe without including the UK, because the UK referendum was, in my view, fueled by false posters around migration.
That's an interesting point,
so
but got nothing to do with the future, because frankly, when it comes to the next European elections, the Brits will not be voting. But around Europe, polling evidence suggests that Mr. Salvini, that Marine Le Pen's party in France, that a whole host of far-right parties in countries as far apart as Poland, Hungary, Austria, you name it, they have the political momentum.
Yeah,
the polls suggest they will be very strong in the next European Parliament.
In Bavaria at the weekend, it was the Greens that actually were the surprise, if you like, vote getters. And there are new figures coming out. Wednesday, you should watch out for them about the mood across Europe. Definitely politics is polarising. I chair the European Parliament, and increasingly when I call votes, you see that the extremes on the right and left vote the same way on issues. So it's not just about ideology here. There's something else happening in the body politic. I mean, I would worry about whether the centre can hold. We're seeing the Social Democrats be quite fractured. Our own EPP, Christian Democrats, that could be a quite difficult election for us.
That's the point I'm making. But you two, the mainstream blocs, the EPP and the European Socialists, to many people, according to the opinion polls, not to me, but according to the opinion polls, to many people around Europe, they look like the tired old Brussels elites who have not delivered. And
well, you see, you're using the language which fueled a referendum here, and quite frankly, it becomes a bit tedious. I may have aged since I got elected, but I'm not tired.
But look what happened in that referendum. Look what happened in the vote in Italy. Look what happens in Hungary and Poland. This is reality. It's not just me.
I know all of that is reality, but my job is not to give in to a reality that I believe would be bad for my children, and I have 4 of them. And in fact, I warn them. I say to them, you have taken for granted peace on this continent because it's there. Nothing is a given. And my biggest worry, and I do tremble with this sometimes, is that we will squander what the European Union did, which was develop peace and prosperity on the continent of Europe, for this idea that you can have your own individual policy or you can be a populist, when all you have to do is say something but not take the responsibility for it. I take responsibility for what I do and what I say, and I hope that in the European Parliament elections we'll talk about Europe and not national issues, because they tend to be about national issues.
And Mairead McGuinness, I appreciate your historical perspective, but here's a quote from a man widely respected around Europe, Pascal Lamy, a former commissioner. He said, without change and reform, the EU will remain, as it is today in his view, irrelevant to a majority of its citizens. Yeah. That is an extraordinarily worrying comment from a Europhile.
Yeah, it is. It's not worrying. I mean, you can worry yourself to death. You have to do something with it. I mean, the first part where he's saying reform and review, of course, that's essential. I mean, the thing about being irrelevant, just hold on a second. In Ireland, for example, many of us took for granted the single market and customs union without understanding what it meant. Since Brexit, right across Europe, because of the debate, people are beginning to understand the single market, the customs union, how drugs are regulated, how chemicals are banned if they're dangerous. And Europe has done that, how pets can be brought on holidays. The smallest to the largest part of how we live today has happened because of the good stuff that Europe does. But frankly, and I was a journalist, no media is interested in the good things. And you're right to focus on all that is difficult and needs to be challenged, because that's my job to do that. But in that time, it's no harm to remind people that without the European Union, where would my country be? We would not be at the table where we at least get respect and have a word. And I think we would be in a much more difficult world.
Mairead McGuinness, we have to end there, but thank you very much for being on Hard Talk.
Thank you. A pleasure.
Thank you.